The day I realized my neighbor had built an entire garage that opened into my driveway, I actually laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, but because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. I remember standing there with a half-empty coffee mug in my hand, staring across the property line, thinking maybe there was some angle I wasn't seeing, maybe some piece of the project hadn't been finished yet. But the longer I looked, the worse it got. The garage door wasn't facing the road. It wasn't facing his backyard. It was aimed directly at my driveway, like somebody had lined it up with a laser. And the craziest part was that by then the project was almost finished. Looking back now, I probably should have seen trouble coming long before that. My wife Emily and I had lived outside a little town called Silver Creek for nearly 12 years. It was one of those places where people still waved from pickup trucks, where neighbors knew each other's dogs by name, where arguments usually ended with a handshake and a beer. Most of the time, anyway. Then a man named Victor Hale bought the property next to ours. Victor wasn't the loudest guy I'd ever met. He wasn't one of those cartoon villains people tell stories about. In fact, if you met him once, you'd probably think he was perfectly pleasant. The problem was that Victor had a habit of treating every conversation like a transaction. Every favor had a price. Every compromise somehow benefited him. Every disagreement somehow became somebody else's fault. The first month after he moved in, he asked if he could temporarily store construction materials near our fence. Then the temporary pile stayed there for 4 months. A year later, he asked if his guests could occasionally use a small section of our turnaround area during a family gathering. Suddenly, there were cars parked there every weekend. None of these things were disasters. They were just little boundary tests. Tiny experiments to see how much room people would give him before pushing back. At the time, I didn't think much about it. I figured everybody has flaws. Then one spring morning demolition crews showed up next door. An old workshop behind Victor's house came down. Excavators arrived. Concrete trucks followed. Framing crews started showing up before sunrise. The project moved fast, faster than most residential construction jobs I'd seen. Every afternoon I'd come home from work, and there would be another major change. One week there was nothing there. The next week there were walls. Then roof trusses. Then exterior sheathing. Emily joked that if we left town for a weekend, we'd probably come back and find a shopping mall sitting behind his house. For the first few weeks, I barely paid attention. It wasn't my project. It wasn't my money. It wasn't my concern. Then one evening, everything changed. I was pulling into my driveway just before sunset when something felt wrong. I couldn't immediately identify it. Have you ever looked at a familiar picture and known something had changed even before you figured out what it was? That's exactly how it felt. I stopped my truck halfway up the driveway and stared toward the new structure. Then it hit me. The opening for the garage door. My stomach tightened instantly. The next morning I walked outside and looked again. Same thing. The opening faced directly toward my property. A few days later the installers arrived and mounted the overhead door tracks. That's when all doubt disappeared. This wasn't temporary framing. This wasn't unfinished construction. This was the design. If a vehicle ever wanted to enter that garage, it would have to drive across my driveway first. There was no practical alternative. The side yard was too narrow. The rear yard was fenced. The angle didn't work from any other direction. The entire garage depended on access through property Victor did not own. I spent several days trying to convince myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe there was an easement I didn't know about. Maybe the county had approved something unusual. Maybe I was missing a detail. Then one afternoon, I walked over and spoke to one of the contractors. He was a friendly older guy named Carl who looked like he'd spent 40 years building things and fixing other people's mistakes. I pointed toward the garage opening and said, "How exactly are they planning to get vehicles in there?" Carl shrugged. "Driveway access." "Whose driveway?" I asked. He looked at me like the answer was obvious. Then he pointed directly toward my property. "That one." For a second I thought he was joking. He wasn't. "Victor told us the access was shared," he said. "That's what we've been working off." I thanked him and walked away before saying anything else, but inside my head alarms were going off. Because years earlier, when Emily and I bought the property, there had been a dispute involving a previous owner and a fence line. As part of the purchase process, I had reviewed every survey, every county record, every easement document I could get my hands on. I remembered those records clearly. There was no shared driveway agreement. No access easement. No right-of-way. Nothing. That night I dug through old filing boxes in the basement. Emily sat at the dining room table while I spread surveys and closing documents across the surface like a detective trying to solve a cold case. Finally, I found the original certified survey. I traced the property line with my finger and felt my pulse speed up. There it was. Exactly where I remembered. The driveway sat entirely inside our parcel. Every inch of it. And Victor's new garage sat just a few feet away from the boundary line. Emily leaned over my shoulder and stared at the survey. Then she looked out the window toward the nearly completed garage. "Tell me I'm wrong," she said quietly. I shook my head. "You're not. So he built a garage that only works if he uses our property?" I folded the survey slowly and stared into the darkness outside. The lights from the construction site glowed against the evening sky. And for the first time, a thought crossed my mind that would end up changing everything. This wasn't an accident anymore. Somebody had either made a breathtakingly expensive mistake, or they believed that once the garage was finished, we'd have no choice except to let them use our driveway forever. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was angry, at least not yet, but because I couldn't stop replaying the situation in my head. Every time I thought about it, I arrived at the same question. How does somebody spend that much money building a structure without confirming they actually have legal access to it? The answer that kept creeping back into my mind was the one I didn't want to believe. Maybe Victor never planned on asking. Maybe he assumed that once the garage was standing there, once the concrete was poured and the door was installed and the money was spent, Emily and I would simply give in. After all, most people hate conflict. Most people would rather tolerate a problem than become the reason somebody loses thousands of dollars. The more I thought about it, the more it felt less like a construction mistake and more like a gamble. A very expensive gamble. The next morning, Emily found me sitting on the porch staring toward the property line. "You're thinking about the garage again," she said. "I am." She sat beside me. "What are you going to do?" I took a long breath. "Honestly, I don't know yet." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said something that stayed with me for the rest of the story. "Whatever happens, don't let somebody else's decision become your responsibility." At the time, it sounded simple. Later, it would become the entire point. For the next few days, I gathered information. I took photographs from multiple angles. I compared them to the survey. I checked county records online. I even spoke with an old friend named Grant who worked in commercial construction. When I showed him the photos, he stared for about 10 seconds before laughing. "You're kidding." I wish I was. He zoomed in on one image. "Unless there's paperwork nobody knows about, this thing is dead." That bad. Worse. Nobody signs off on vehicle access through somebody else's land without legal rights. Hearing it from someone in the industry made me realize I wasn't imagining the problem. The issue was real. So instead of confronting Victor, I decided to ask a question. Just one question. I emailed the county building department. I attached the survey, attached the photographs, and wrote a short message asking whether the approved plans included vehicle access through my property. No accusations. No demands. No threats. Just a request for clarification. 2 days later, I got my answer. Around 9 o'clock, a county inspection truck pulled up next door. I happened to be working from home that day, and from my office window, I had a front row seat to the entire show. The inspector, a woman named Denise Porter, stepped out carrying a folder thick enough to stop a bullet. She walked around the structure several times, taking notes, measuring distances, studying the garage opening. Then she met with the foreman. At first, their conversation seemed routine. Then I watched the foreman's posture change. His shoulders tightened. He crossed his arms. He started flipping through paperwork. 10 minutes later, Victor arrived. I could tell immediately that whatever Denise had found was not good news. Victor marched across the yard with the confidence of a man expecting a misunderstanding to be cleared up. 15 minutes later, he looked like a man who had just discovered the misunderstanding belonged to him. Even from my window, I could see the frustration building. He pointed toward my driveway. Denise pointed at the plans. He pointed toward the garage. She pointed at the plans again. Eventually, she unfolded a large document and held it open in front of him. Whatever was on that page changed everything. The argument stopped. The color drained from Victor's face. Then came the moment the entire neighborhood would end up talking about for months. Denise walked back to her truck, opened the rear compartment, and pulled out a bright red notice. Every contractor knows what those notices mean. Nothing good ever follows one. She walked over to the structure and attached it directly to the front framing. Construction stopped immediately. Nail guns went silent. Workers packed equipment. Trucks started leaving. In less than an hour, a project that had been moving full speed for weeks was completely frozen. That evening, Victor showed up at my front door. I knew before opening it that the conversation wasn't going to be pleasant. The second I stepped outside, he said, "You called the county." "Not hello. Not how are you. Just an accusation." "I sent an email," I replied. "I had a question." His jaw tightened. "You could have come to me." "Could I?" I asked. "Because nobody came to me before designing a garage around my driveway." For a moment his eyes narrowed. Then something interesting happened. The anger disappeared, and a salesman walked into the conversation. His voice softened. His posture relaxed. Suddenly he was trying to make a deal. "Look," he said, "this doesn't have to be complicated." Whenever somebody starts a sentence that way, complicated is exactly what follows. "The driveway's already there," he continued. "You barely use that side anyway. We can work something out." There it was. The real plan. Not permission before construction. Permission after construction. He wasn't asking me to help solve a problem. He was asking me to absorb the consequences of one. "Victor," I said calmly, "when exactly were you planning to discuss this with us?" He hesitated. Just for a second. But that second told me everything. Because there was no answer. There never had been. Finally he said, "I assumed it wouldn't matter." I nodded slowly. And that's where we see things differently. The conversation went downhill from there. He accused me of being unreasonable. I accused him of building first and asking questions later. At one point he actually said, "You're making this a much bigger issue than it needs to be." I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the statement was so absurd. "Victor," I said, "I didn't build a garage that opens into somebody else's driveway." That ended the discussion. He turned around and walked away without another word. Over the following weeks, the investigation continued. Denise reviewed permit records, construction submissions, and revised drawings. Eventually, the truth came out. The plans approved by the county showed a completely different garage orientation. Somewhere between approval and construction, the design changed. Whether it happened intentionally or through carelessness hardly mattered anymore. The result was the same. The structure that existed on the ground no longer matched the structure that had been approved. Worse, it required permanent access across private property that Victor did not own. The county's final determination arrived about 3 weeks later. Victor was given 2 options. Option 1 was obtaining a legally recorded easement from Emily and me. Option 2 was rebuilding the garage entrance so it functioned entirely within his own parcel. At first glance, the decision seemed obvious. But easements aren't simple favors. They become part of the property record. Future owners inherit them. Future disputes inherit them. Future liabilities inherit them. Once granted, they can affect property values, insurance considerations, maintenance obligations, and access rights for decades. Emily and I spent several evenings discussing it. One night we sat on the back deck watching the unfinished garage glow beneath a security light. "Do you feel sorry for him?" she asked. I stared toward the structure for a long moment. "A little." "Me too." We sat quietly for a few seconds. Then she smiled and said, "Not enough to donate part of our property rights, though." I laughed. "No, definitely not that much." Deep down, I think both of us understood the same thing. If Victor had approached us before construction started, the outcome might have been different. Maybe we still would have said no. Maybe we would have negotiated something. Maybe there would have been conditions. But we would have had a choice. Instead, the choice had been made for us. The assumption had already been built into concrete, lumber, labor costs, permit fees, and months of planning. Eventually, our answer went back to the county. No easement, no shared access, no permanent rights through our property. And when that decision became official, Victor's construction problem transformed into a financial disaster that nobody could stop. About 2 weeks after the county received our final decision, the contractors returned. The funny thing was, when I saw the trucks pull up that morning, for a split second I thought maybe the project had somehow been approved after all. Maybe lawyers had gotten involved. Maybe some forgotten document had surfaced. Maybe there was a loophole nobody had noticed. Then I saw the dumpsters. Then I saw the demolition crew. And that's when I realized they weren't there to finish the garage. They were there to undo it. I'll be honest, standing there with a cup of coffee in my hand, watching workers remove pieces of a structure that had already been built, felt surreal. There was no dramatic music, no cheering crowd, no movie-style celebration. Just a group of tired construction guys doing expensive work for the second time. The garage door came out first, then the tracks, then sections of framing around the opening. Every few minutes another piece disappeared. The sound of saws echoed through the neighborhood from sunrise until late afternoon. More than once I caught workers shaking their heads. One of them walked past me carrying a stack of lumber and said, "I've been doing this 25 years. This is one of the dumbest situations I've ever seen." I didn't even know how to respond. Because honestly, he wasn't wrong. The strangest part was Victor himself. For months he had carried himself like a man who always had the answer. A man who expected the world to adjust around him. But after the county ruling, something changed. He stopped hosting backyard gatherings. He stopped offering opinions about everyone else's property. He stopped acting like he owned every conversation. One afternoon, while the reconstruction work was underway, I ran into him near the fence line. For a moment neither of us said anything. The sound of hammers echoed from behind him. Finally he looked toward the partially demolished garage and sighed. Not an angry sigh, not a frustrated sigh, more like the sound a person makes when reality finally catches up with them. "This whole thing got away from me," he said quietly. It was probably the most honest sentence I'd ever heard him speak. I nodded. "Looks that way." He stared at the structure for a few seconds, then asked something I hadn't expected. "If I'd come to you first, before any of this started, would you have considered it?" That question hung in the air between us. And the truth is, I genuinely didn't know. Maybe, maybe not. Property rights are serious. Permanent easements aren't small favors. But what I did know was that the question should have been asked before the foundation was poured, not after the walls were standing. So I looked at him and answered as honestly as I could. "You would have had a chance." He nodded slowly. No argument. No excuses. No blame. Just a quiet understanding of where things had gone wrong. A few months later the garage was finally completed. The entrance had been redesigned and relocated. The vehicle access worked entirely from Victor's side of the property. The county approved it. The red notice disappeared. The project was officially finished. Life gradually returned to normal. But stories like this never really disappear in small communities. Years later, people still talk about it. New neighbors hear the story from old neighbors. Contractors mention it when discussing permits. Surveyors mention it when discussing easements. It's become one of those local cautionary tales that refuses to die. And the lesson isn't really about garages. It's about assumptions. It's about what happens when somebody mistakes confidence for permission. Because ownership isn't determined by what feels reasonable. It's determined by surveys, deeds, boundaries, and agreements. You can't simply build your plans on someone else's property and hope they'll be too polite to stop you. Looking back now, I don't feel victorious. I don't feel guilty either. Mostly, I feel grateful that we took the time to verify the facts before reacting emotionally. We didn't start a shouting match. We didn't hire lawyers on day one. We didn't wage some neighborhood war. We asked a question, the county found an answer, and reality handled the rest. But here's the part that still divides people whenever I tell this story. Some folks believe we should have granted the easement and helped the neighbor avoid a costly mistake. Others believe saying no was the only reasonable response because the entire situation existed due to his own decisions. Even today, I hear strong arguments from both sides. So now I'm curious about what you think. If you were standing in my shoes, would you have signed the easement and let the garage stay exactly where it was? Or would you have protected your property rights and forced the redesign? Was Victor treated fairly? Or did the consequences become bigger than the original mistake? Let me know in the comments, because I have a feeling this one is going to split opinions right down the middle. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor who assumed they could use your land, your driveway, your fence line, or anything else that wasn't theirs, share your story too. These situations happen a lot more often than people realize. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for the next one. Because sometimes the most expensive words a property owner can say are, "I thought it wouldn't be a problem."